After the battle to save Earth was over, a lot of us wanted immediately to turn our guns to the wider universe and take revenge for what they had done to not only our people, but to our mother planet. But now was not the time. Now was a time to recover our dead, count up who remained, fix them up, recover what was left, find out why they did this, what was their goal, although we have a good idea, and get ourselves ready for the next battle. Our rage will never subside from this moment as they have come to our planet. Though they were smart enough to, if they come to our home, they brought one hell of a big gun, but they forgot something. If you're gonna come to someone's house with a big gun, you better kill him. Because if you don't, guess what? We shoot back. Looking around, we could see that all the non-organic material we would need, along with much organic material, was simply floating in space. We tried what we could to keep most of the wreckage from plummeting through the atmosphere and crashing into the planet, causing even more problems, but that space station, at least one of them that was completely perforated, got caught up in the gravity well, and there was no stopping it. Along with that, several of the large ships had crashed through. There was a lot of debris. It must have looked like the world's biggest fireworks show from the surface. It might have been pretty if it wasn't for the fact that all this shit's going to be like the world's worst artillery barrage across the world. Oh, good God, I can't even imagine what they were going through down there. We tried our best to blast away any debris before it made it into the atmosphere, hoping it would burn up if it was in small enough pieces, but holy merciful crap, that didn't really happen. I saw several of these ships tumble, rip into pieces, but still hit with the force of several Moabs. It was destruction almost to the same level as those frickin' energy weapons. We ended up going down and salvaging what we could and who we could, of course. I burned my fabricator almost completely dry, making bandages and anything else we could make. Thankfully, a lot of the infrastructure that hadn't actually been hit by the energy weapons was still intact. But the Earth itself, at least surface level Earth, was almost completely uninhabitable. Humans would have to pack up and leave. We couldn't stay there. The Earth needed time to heal. As my crew and I began to shuttle people from Earth to different stations, usually simply to larger ships because they could not land on the planet very easily, but us smaller corvettes could easily go down, fill up, and shuttle people back and forth. We received more and more intel, plus what we saw, and it was pretty much as I figured. What it was a three-pronged attack. The first wave was simply to spread our forces out. The attack on Mars and eventually the attack on Venus were there specifically to try and pull our forces away from Earth. The second wave was to pull the forces farther away from the planet and bring them into small pockets. This way, when they brought in their planet-destroying, killing, whatever in the hell laser doohickeys you want to call that they would come in around the same time as the space stations, believing that we would fire on the space stations first and burn through our ordnance, and that would allow them to start scorching our planet. It was a good plan, it just didn't work. Why? Simply put, humans hold the line. I remember biting my lip to the point where it was bleeding, looking at Mars being totally destroyed on its surface, watching its fleet being torn asunder by just unbelievable amounts of alien craft. But I did not leave, and neither did anyone else. We knew Earth was going to be their target, and we had to hold position, and we did. And because of that, their entire battle plan fell apart. I cannot imagine how long it took for them to actually build these massive machines, even if they did have fabricators as good as ours. The nearest calculation was going to be to build one of those space stations would take almost a decade. Simply put, a fabricator would be strained to its absolute limits, just simply building deck after deck after deck after deck after trying to build the core of it. The core being its reactor engine, as you can't put that on the outside. It has too much of a gravimetric pull. It is the gravity, of course, to a space station. That being said, I simply looked around at the debris field and told my crew to take their fighters and go grab as much of it as we could. We needed to feed our fabricators because they required mass. It didn't matter what they had, just make sure they separate the organic from non-organic. We'll find a way to figure out what to do with the organic matter. I didn't tell them I already had a plan. But every time that we shuttled more people in, I caught the fighters on their way through. They simply docked and unloaded everything. The fabricator for non-organic material was completely loaded and breaking everything down as we were stacking up more and more and more debris. The bodies and whatever they could find as organic matter was simply shoved into the fabricator for organics. Yes, you have to have two separate ones. It doesn't work the other way around. To our crew's dismay, and to the dismay of many of the younger ones, once the fabricators were full as far as organic, most of the organic material they found was alien bodies. We had them stacked up like cordwood in the corner. At one point, one of the pilots came out of her fighter, dropped another body off to the side, leaned over and puked. I felt really bad for her. No young one should ever have to deal with this sort of thing, ever. I gave her some time off as we had been working pretty much non-stop for 4 days, and even though they're genetically engineered, they have their limits. I made sure they all got rotated out as best I could, but we still had to load up with as much material as possible. The fabricators would need to work like crazy. Thankfully, they're all automated. They just need stuff shoveled into their containment area, and then it simply loads itself. That being said, it was still difficult. Once we were completely loaded with our own reserves with the fabricators, the non-organic ones began to make all sorts of ordnance, missiles, torpedoes, more engine components, everything that we thought we might need. Armor plating, especially for this ship. The Corvette would need to run almost consecutively through all this debris, and every once in a while you would hear the noticeable clang on the side as all sorts of debris would bounce up against it, causing a little bit of damage, but not too much, but enough that it would need repair eventually. Along with that, the organic fabricator, once our stores were completely full, we had it design extra nutrition bars. At least that's what we called it. We tried to give it a nice name, but it was just extremely dense nutrients in a simple bar. The bar looked like a mix between Play-Doh, chalk, and a turd. It was just crazy. But it would definitely keep you alive. Wasn't very tasty. In fact, it didn't have much flavor at all. But again, it would keep you alive. And as the refugees came up, we started handing these out by the actual bucket load and told them to load up as much as they can, because they don't know where they're going, if the fabricators are going to be able to keep up with the new demand. But we did. And it wasn't just us either. Every single ship did the same thing. And as we started looking at what was going on, we figured out what the original battle plan was. And I remembered the only one true rule in warfare, and that is to never underestimate your opponent. They underestimated us, but just barely. Had their plan paid off and we had gone after the bait. As I looked around inside the cargo hold at all the personnel that we were bringing to the stations, I realized they wouldn't be sitting here. They'd be molten slag on the surface, or still be stuck inside their bunkers, Unfortunately for a lot of people, they even had bunkers in their backyards, realizing that some sort of bombardment might happen. They didn't know that the energy weapon was going to cook so deep into the surface, and that bunker became their tomb. Each of those bunkers turned into a microwave, basically, and all the metal that was there was seized shut. All of it. The only way to get into these bunkers now was to actually break them open with a jackhammer. But for now, let them rest. They earned it. After over a week of us traveling people back and forth to their new space station or their new colony, I realized that we were now getting less and less personnel to pick up. It was to the point where the Earth itself was not able to maintain anyone. In fact, I had to fly in there via sensors as everything was just a big dust bowl. It was a complete brownout, but you don't get brownouts when you're using anti-grav motors. There's no downburst phenomenon at all. But here we were, trying to fly through all this crap. I could see a whole bunch of lights going back and forth from men's exosuits as they were looking for survivors. And out of all of it, one thing broke my heart above everything else. It was a young soldier. I had opened up the cargo bay and was waving him in as my XO got the ship ready to take off again. It was only the one soldier in a full exosuit walking with his wife cradled in his arms. And in her arms was their child. As they walked into the cargo hold, he retracted his helmet, and I saw the look in his eyes, and I looked at her. She was long gone, and so was the child. That whole situation had broken him, and he did not say a single word to me. He simply went to the corner, sat down, and cradled his wife and child. I could empathize with him. I never had a spouse. I was never lucky enough to have children. I simply looked around for any others who were coming. He would be the only one to get into the Corvette at that point, as I told the XO to take off. I still remember his response. You sure? We don't want to pick up. I said lift off and head for the nearest military boat if you can find it. If there's any close by, I want to dock with them immediately. When we were on our way there, I realized which one it was. It was one of the very large frigates that had made through the battle. Not exactly unscathed, as there were parts actually blown clean off, but it was still flying. I contacted them and told them I had one of theirs on board. They asked, does he require medical assistance? I said, no. He requires your chaplain. The chaplain? Why would he require a... Yes, sir. Chaplain will be standing by. I simply turned off the comms, and as we docked, I went and picked up the man himself. He could barely stand up on his own. His mind was still in shock. As the cargo bays opened, I was still trying to get myself under his arm. I wasn't wearing an exosuit, so trying to lift him up was something else. Immediately, a bunch of other soldiers came in their suits and got around him trying to pick him up. Eventually, we had to simply carry him out. His legs weren't working. He wasn't looking around. He wasn't even crying anymore. I looked at him. I looked at his family. In that moment, something left me. Something was gone. Part of my humanity that I had been holding on to with both hands left me at that moment, and I could not hold anything in. I wanted blood so bad I could fucking taste it. and so did everyone else. It was like Pearl Harbor. You have to save those you can, rebuild, and then be ready to fight. But the rebuilding started immediately. Those that were still able to raise a hammer, raise a fist, even move, were willing to come out and build more fabricators. As long as others went out to try and get as much food as possible to keep them going, the organic fabricators didn't make the tastiest of meals, but you know what? It'll keep you going. And the sheer anger and hatred in everyone's eyes as they worked diligently to assemble larger and larger fabricators, some of them the size of a freaking space station themselves. I knew that this truly lit the fire under humanity's ass. But I wonder if there was any humanity left. Over 6 months later, and I finally was able to get some time. With that, we made course for our friends' planets. I wanted to make sure they were still intact. Even though I was told that they hadn't been touched, I had to see it myself. I had to. And as we made our way across, we finally got to the Chitter's planet. And yes, they had been untouched. The battle group that was there to protect them was still pristine and waiting for a fight. The satellites were still fully locked on, fully loaded, waiting for someone to come in. The planet had been upgraded so much. The Chitters and the Chitter Queens had done everything they could to make their society even better than before. I didn't have a chance to go down, but I was told that pretty soon they would not need a defense fleet as they were building their own. They had fabricators that we had sent them, and they were using them extensively to make their own defenses, but their own style of defenses. I asked why, and I never did get a straight answer. But they were not my primary goal. Eventually, we started heading towards the Zell planet, and my heart dropped out of my ass as I suddenly received something on my comms that I really didn't want to see. It was an emergency beacon. The emergency beacon I had given Junior was going off. I immediately transferred this to the rest of the crew and to the rest of the fleets out there. Our allies were being torn apart. You better get your asses over there. They weren't sure what I was talking about, but it only took another 15 to 20 minutes before the distress call from the battle group protecting their planet was calling for aid. We were already on our way, me with a small group, and when we jumped in, we saw something we really didn't want to see. Another mixed group of battleships and destroyers were going in towards the planet. There was a complete furball happening as we got closer. They must have seen us jumping in, although everybody can see us as we jumped in, with that much energy bursting. And they immediately dispatched a group towards us, but they didn't realize how totally pissed off we were. The moment, and I mean the absolute moment we got into weapons range, we gave them a full volley, and the ones that had separated to face us down basically disintegrated in space 42 seconds later as the torpedoes smashed into their ships with reckless abandonment. We had sent more than triple what was needed to take them out, but we didn't give a shit. At that point, we hadn't even launched fighters yet. And the fighters, given the fact that mass and thrust makes them go a whole lot faster since they're almost completely just jets and guns with a cockpit attached. That's all they are. I told my crew the 3-word order that they all wanted to hear. Kill them all! And with that, the fighters were out before I could even get in the cockpit of my own. And they were already on their way. Before I even had to give them an order, they started going at what was left of the alien group with reckless efficiency, even though the battle group that was still left behind, that was ours, was getting tore up pretty bad. They had fallen back to the defense satellites, which gave them additional firepower. They were keeping the enemy at bay, but we didn't know for how long. And because of that, we didn't have any time to waste. As my own fighter bursted away at best speed, I checked the sensors, And holy shit, everybody had the same idea. We didn't have to be told crap. And just as those fighters got within range, they fired a full volley of torpedoes and missiles as soon as they could, and then they just hit their rockets and bounced out of the line of fire. They knew that the 2 destroyers and 6 frigates that were with us, if they had a clean shot, they were going to take it whether you were in the way or not. But they were still lagging behind. I knew that they were falling in at best speed, but again, mass versus thrust, it's still a thing. But they didn't have to wait too long. Actually, they didn't have much of a chance to fire. The battle groups that were fighting each other, the alien versus ours, were surprised by the fact that suddenly there was a mass of torpedoes heading their way. The alien fleet tried to turn, bank away, but they were not expecting that the defense fleet would charge their lines and fire everything they had left. I could actually see with my own eyes the weapons going hot, glowing so hot. I could only imagine that the safety protocols had been turned off as they were firing desperately into the attacking fleet. The attacking fleet thought that maybe they could get out of this pincer move by facing us down instead, but they ended up taking all the torpedoes straight to the face, and the battle was over within another 30 seconds as both sides laid waste to them. As I got close to the planet, I realized there was something off. I began to scan everything, and I was completely put back by one set of debris. One very, very large piece of debris. There was no mistaking it. This was one of those planet glassing ships. Oh, fuck, was all I said. We immediately went down towards the planet. I went straight past it all. Didn't even stop. Only told them that I was friendly by pinging my IFF code on the way by and heading straight towards the town that I had left my family at. My family that was not human. As I got down there, I had seen that a lot of debris had fallen down and hit areas around them, but there was nothing direct. I immediately landed, got out, and I ran over, started screaming for them, asking, "Where are you? Where are you?" I saw the rest of the ships coming in. All the fighters landed, and they began calling as well. I almost had to tell them, "Hey, it's a cold planet. Go put some damn clothes on already." But I didn't care at that point, because what I saw just killed me. I turned a corner, and there was a young female Zell holding Junior. I ran over screaming for him. "Junior, tell me, are you alive?" I grabbed him. She was hesitant because she's just seen this giant biped run at her, but I couldn't hide the tears coming down my face as I thought he was dead. As I reached and checked his pulse, he was still alive. He was just knocked out. Whatever concussion had messed him up had thrown him against a wall. I could tell by the bruise on the side of his head that he had taken one hell of a crack to the cranium, but he was alive. I looked around. I started asking the young female, "Where's his parents?" She pointed over, and I ran towards the building, literally knocking the door right off its hinges as I went inside. And I found them. Scared and in the corner, but alive. Oh, thank God. I ran over and gave them a hug as their cousin came out and saw me and with complete elation came over to get me. Unfortunately, it wasn't the same around the whole village, as many were still screaming in pain, mental and emotional pain, as their friends had not survived. I was grateful that mine had. I was beyond grateful. I went back, and my crew had already picked up Junior and made a makeshift litter and was carrying him inside with what I found out was his mate. They were a bit young to be married, but not too young to be betrothed to each other, which is their custom. I didn't care at that point. We just went and got the medical supplies and did what we could. I went immediately to my comms, called up to the Corvette, and told it to land right next to us. We needed all the supplies on board. Tell the fabricator to start making medical supplies as fast as possible. All I got was, "Yes, sir." And within an hour, the Corvette was on the ground, and we were grabbing all the supplies out and just started screaming for everybody to come out and get what they needed. We brought out crates and barrels full of those nutrient bars. The nutrient bars are set up to be an entire day's worth of ration for a human, so one was more than enough for one of the Zells for almost a week. They saw this, and it was like a weight had been lifted off their shoulders. I asked them where the ship had fired, because it obviously had zapped the planet. And they had told me that it had hit on the other side, but thankfully our own fleet had targeted it, primary target, and just tore it to pieces. I guess it is a glass cannon. I wonder how many of these frickin' things are still out there. I would be on that planet for 2 weeks. 2 weeks of digging through rubble looking for survivors. 2 weeks of recovering survivors, recovering bodies, and recovering body parts. 2 weeks of trying to rebuild their homes. 2 weeks of getting parts from the fabricator to get their infrastructure going, get their water running at the very least, get the electrical running at the very least, clearing their roads. My crew was helping out as well, but they seemed to have trouble keeping up. They're still young, of course. The only one I didn't have in my crew was the XO. After seeing everything that had gone on, he asked to return to his mate over on Venus. I told him it was okay, and he immediately took my fighter craft and left. We left the Corvette there as we needed the fabricators on hand. The fighters at best have one small fabricator, and that's for food. That's in case you get stuck out in the middle of God's nowhere waiting to be retrieved. And with everything that was going on, not only was it pain to lose so many, but the rage of humanity could not be even hidden from our allies. The chain of command had gone up to the Chitter's queen and told her what had happened. Since the Chitters weren't exactly the most desired creatures, mainly because they were, well, annoying when they worked. Even though they worked very well, they were always kind of creepy for everyone, just because of the way the drones operated. So they were not on the high priority list. The Zells, on the other hand, given their intelligence, their size, and their strength comparative to that size, were very highly prized. But since they had fought away from their oppressors, and since everyone hated humanity so much, I guess they wanted to make an example of them. We knew that the war was on. The war that we had prayed would not happen was here now. And the enemy had done something you really don't want to do. They made it personal. For another year, we rebuilt. We put everything back together on the Zell's planet. We tried what we could to save their planet, their livestock, their flora, fauna, and all that other fun shit, but it was difficult to say the least. They were grateful to have a human or two around to help out with some of the larger items. My crew could help as they were about the size of humans, and pretty soon, once they grew up completely, they would be. But they didn't quite have our strength. They were meant to be decorative. They weren't meant to be as functional as we are. I couldn't hold that against them, as they were all nice to look at. I still don't know how the genetic alteration of that works, but it was what it was. Though after 6 months of seeing the destruction and hating those that had brought it, the fleet was almost fully rebuilt, at least in strength of numbers when it comes to equipment. We were still short a bit on personnel, which take years and years and years. We did consider creating our own, genetically engineering our own warriors, but that would be against everything we have fought against from now on. I remember walking into the council chambers themselves as they were debating this fact. Since I had made a name for myself, I simply walked in without any issues. They all saw my rank. They all saw who I was, and the sentries just got out of my way and snapped to attention with a salute. As I walked in, immediately everyone shut the hell up and listened. I told them, with my own crew standing behind me, don't even think about it. This is what they do. This is who we're fighting against. They did this. Though I know they're grateful to be alive, I wouldn't ever do this to create weapons. They created my crew to be pleasure for them. Are we going to stoop down to that? Are we going to become that in which we hate? I know when you fight the devil, you must become the devil himself. But if we lose ourselves in this fight, then what the fuck are we fighting for? I left the entire council chamber in contemplation. A few of them tried to fight back at me, but I shot them back a death glare. In other words, don't even talk, pal. And with that simple statement, I turned around, and with my crew behind me, we walked out. And with that taken care of, we started relying more and more on AI. The AIs themselves would be designed specifically for each ship. We would end up designing them ourselves. In many cases, we would simply have the base code set up after our own brain scans. I scanned not only myself, but my entire crew. Junior, his family, all of them. And we merged them all together. It took the computer about 24 days to try and figure out exactly what type of personality it wanted to be, but the AIs were still efficient, extremely efficient. So much so that we no longer needed anyone manning any turrets. Not only did I not have to focus on it myself, but the AI would take care of that. And with that, we supplemented our shortages in manpower. We also had small robots going around to repair things as well, which helped a little bit, but we all kept thinking the same thing. Are we becoming slave masters of robots? This question would plague us forever. However, we still needed them. We required their assistance to make sure that we were ready to take the battle straight towards our enemy. We had sent many scouts out, and I talked to a few of them as they came back. They found out that the enemy that had sent all those ships, all those personnel, had actually drained almost every single battleship, every single fighting ship of destroyer, frigate class, everything. Which is why they sent that space stations, because they actually ran out of things to throw at us. We kind of chuckled at this. The fact that they had drained themselves completely to try and bleed us out. And in fact, they had bled themselves dry. There had been a lot of turmoil in a lot of their different sectors because they did not want to build these ships again. They wanted to spend their time rebuilding families. They wanted to spend their time rebuilding their commerce. But they had more pressing issues than trying to rebuild a fleet, which cost a lot of time and a lot of materials. They did not have as many planets to strip mine as you would think, and they ended up having to start doing what we were doing, which was going out into their own asteroid belts, their own fields, and start salvaging any materials they could. We kind of chuckled at this. Why weren't they doing that in the first place? Well, it's not as cost effective. But screw cost effectiveness when it comes to survival. And now we had our moment as the last scout came back. We found out this quick piece of information. The slave leaders, those 5 to 7 species that decided that they were better than everyone else and they would trade in slaves and be a slaving nation, were now getting ready to fight each other. They believed that they had knocked us back into the Stone Age. They believed that we would be spending so much time trying to rebuild and repopulate that they would have plenty of time to deal with each other. And then they would become dominant of each other. This whole thing about dominance and submission around the universe is driving me absolutely freaking batty. What type of hell is this universe? Were we surrounded by the org field and protected in heaven or something? What in the ever-loving crap is going on? But that was our moment when we realized if they're busy fighting each other, that gives us an option, an opening, a way of taking them down. And as reports came in of different fleets having at each other, using basically slaves as their cannon fodder, we realized that we had to pick our target carefully. But our target was not picked by us, no. The Chitter Queens had decided to build their own fleets, and they decided that they would be the first ones since they were the only planet not engaged by the enemy fleet. No one would expect them to come up with anything. The Chitters themselves, until they became slaves, were not even close to a spacefaring race. Hell, they were barely beyond insect mounds at that point. Though they could outthink each other, it wasn't much. But now they could reproduce in numbers and create ships in numbers that would just stagger the mind. They chose the closest sector they could, and before we even knew what was going on, they had invaded and captured the planet. When they went in, they had taken down the entire armada that was around them. If you want to call that an armada, I would call it a small battle group. Their fleet just simply overwhelmed them with numbers, taking some of the cues from us and going in with their long-range weapons at first, firing the torpedoes, then when they got close, missiles, and then direct-fire ballistic weapons. It was a slaughter. And when they landed, they told us that they were laughing. The Chitters laugh, which is actually painful to listen to. If you ever listen to nails across a chalkboard, think of that, just slow scratch at an extremely high pitch. It's actually painful to human ears to listen to it. But they were laughing as the slave masters would beg them to stop, offering more slaves to become slave masters themselves. The Chitters looked over, and one of the key things was they were holding two humans in front on their knees, draped in chains. The Chitters had called back to their queens. Their lead drones had come down specifically to look at this. They showed us the video of the lead drone, who looked much larger than their normal drone, a good 7 feet tall, and its carapace was very, very large. It reached down to each of the humans, got underneath their jaw, and raised their heads. On the video, we could see that these humans had had the shit kicked out of them multiple times, both of them female. The Alpha drone stood them up, reached for what little bit of clothing they had, and lifted them. And that was enough for us to be beyond pissed. The Alpha drone, even though they do not reproduce the same way we do, they know that if a woman is forced on, if their queen had been forced on by another, they would take it extremely personal. So they decided to take this one personal for us. There was not a single slave species that left that planet. They simply became the Chitters' next meal. It was disgusting to watch. However, we let them have this as they sent a ship towards us before we even had a chance to send a destroyer towards them. They had contacted us and told us that they had human refugees. They had freed human slaves. And with that, they cemented themselves as our allies for now on to eternity. And it was good to have friends. And as we retrieved them, we got another message. The Zels had begun to launch their own ships, though much smaller than a human ship because, well, they don't need that much room. They're smaller than we are. They still pack a hell of a punch. The thing was just bristling with weapons. And their first response to us, their first call when that ship got into orbit was simple. So, who's first?